I'm Martin Weaver, the manager of the Light Sport Aviation branch here in Oklahoma City. I would like to welcome you to our two presentations. The first presentation will focus on Sport Pilot Instructor, and the Sport Pilot Examiner program. The second section will focus on aircraft registration, airworthiness, and the repairman certificates associated with the Light Sport Aircraft program. At the end of both sections, we will have a short question and answer period. As you see up here, this is the branch title, Light Sport Aviation Branch. The Flight Standards Service stood the branch up on 18th of April. I became the first manager of the branch, and since then we've tried to make ourselves available to the public with either, I call it snail mail up there. If you want to send it by mail, you can send comments to us. If you want to call us, there's a generic line. What we'll do is when we get your question, if somebody doesn't actually answer the phone, we'll respond to you, whatever your question is. We have a website. This website will become very important here shortly because a lot of the documentation that we will have available to the public, such as the applications and the handbooks and the advisory circulars, will all be up there on that website. We also have an email address here. If you forget to put the dash in there, it still works, and we'll respond to you via email. So anytime you have any questions, comments, suggestions, please feel free to contact us, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. This is the branch itself right now. On the operations side of the house, I have 2 inspectors and 1 subject matter expert flight instructor, and then I have 2 airworthiness inspectors to help this program go right now. The plan is to hire 2 more inspectors and to get me a program assistant to do the paperwork that I don't like doing. But hopefully that'll grow by December. We'll have all those people on board. So as our branch grows, our responsibilities grow. We'll talk a little later in this presentation about the examiner program. This examiner program is going to be unique in that it's going to be run right out of our office. It's a national program. It will not be run by the district office for the Sport Pilot Examiner program. Okay? And we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Larry.
Okay. What I'm going to do is we're going to go through slide by slide and kind of look at some of the numbers. Most people know what this is right now. These numbers were coming out and everybody wanted to know during the NPRM period what they were, how it was going to work. So here's what happened in the final rule. This is what defines by FAR Part 1 what a light sport type aircraft is. Any aircraft that fits in this definition that I'm getting ready to give you is a light sport type aircraft. And as a sport pilot, you can fly that aircraft. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. The big numbers that everybody needs to know right off the bat is the 1320. Anything that's more than 1,320 pounds does not make a light sport aircraft. Maximum speed of VH, 120 knots. VH is a different term that we haven't really used before. What VH is maximum continuous power. So an aircraft under maximum continuous power can't go faster than 120 knots. Got a never exceed speed for gliders. Stalling speed, this is another one that either we've seen that kind of make or break aircraft coming into the light sport type arena. 45 knots, no lift enhancing devices, meaning flaps. Maximum of 2 people, 2 persons in the airplane. That doesn't mean it can have 4 seats and you can carry 2 people. It can only have 2 seats in the aircraft. A single reciprocating engine. In this one, the intent here was a single, 1 engine, reciprocating, but they did intend for you to be able to use a diesel engine or a rotary engine. So those 2 engines will work too. A fixed or ground adjustable propeller, that means you can ground adjust it, you can get out, turn a wrench, change the prop pitch, tighten it back up. That's what that means. And if it's a powered glider, of course, it can be fixed or auto feathering. Okay, for gyroplanes, it has to be a fixed pitch, semi-rigid teetering 2-blade system for the gyroplanes. If you have a cabin, a lot of these aircraft don't, but if you do have a cabin, non-pressurized, fixed landing gear, except for aircraft intended for operation on the water. or a glider. What they come up with here was the term repositionable landing gear. Now the FAA has, retractable gear, which gliders can have. Repositionable gear for aircraft intended for operation on the water means that you can take off and you can retract the gear by a simple lever type mechanism, and then you can put it back down. But it can't be a complex system like hydraulics or electrics or anything like that. Just a simple up-down is what they mean by repositionable gear. This definition is light sport aircraft. So if an aircraft fits in that definition, it is a light sport aircraft or a light sport type aircraft. So what type of aircraft are subject to this rule? Well, all the two-place training vehicles that are out there now, the quote ultralights or the heavy ultralights, what you're seeing here, the Quicksilver type airplanes, this one right here, weight shift control type aircraft, powered parachutes. These are the two-place training vehicles that are out there right now. These will transition over and be light sport aircraft. Experimental aircraft, experimental amateur built. If those experimental amateur builds fit in that definition that I just give you, a sport pilot can fly it. Now, does that mean that like an RV-8 would fit? No. But some of these little single-engine type airplanes, like you're seeing right up here, and of course the gyroplanes, they're going to fit, and you'll be able to fly them as a sport pilot. There's two brand new categories coming out, airworthiness certificates, which we'll talk about here in just a second. One of them, special light sport. These are factory-built type aircraft, and it's a special light sport airworthiness certificate. And the other one's experimental light sport, and we'll go into that here in just a minute. Any primary category type aircraft, which I think there was only two built. One of them was Quicksilver built one, and then Rand's built one. So if there's any of those type of aircraft out there, if they fit in that definition, they're light sport aircraft. And then standard category aircraft that you see, the J3 Cub, that fit. So there's a lot of standard category aircraft out there with the white airworthiness certificate in there that a sport pilot can fly. So these are the aircraft subject to this rule. Here's some of the aircraft that are standard category aircraft that fell under, that we went and looked at and fell under the light sport rule. And as you can see, there's quite a bit. If you'll go to our website, there's a complete list, and this is just a sampling of some of the aircraft. The complete list is on our website, so if you want to go find out if an aircraft that you have falls into this rule, you can go there, pull it up. If it's there, that's a light sport aircraft that's already been looked at and falls within that definition. Okay, here's the two airworthiness certificates, brand new, that they're getting ready to come out with. One's Special Light Sport Airworthiness Certificate. That's a factory-built aircraft, can be used for rental and instruction. It meets consensus standards from the FAASTeam. Now this is a new type, something that we've never done before with the FAA. We're actually going out and the industry that are building these aircraft got together under FAASTeam and said, let's decide how we can best build an aircraft. And they come to the FAA. We looked at it and said, yes, this will work, and we accepted it. And that's how these brand new aircraft are going to be built. These aircraft have to be maintained by a repairman with a maintenance rating, which we'll talk about in the next program, or a rated A&P mechanic. And if you're going to use these aircraft for rental and instruction, which they can be, they're required to have a condition inspection every 100 hours. Now the experimental light sport certificates, there's several ways you can get into that, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But these aircraft normally cannot be used for instructional rental. There is an exception to that, which we'll talk about on the next slide. They can be maintained by the owner. Anybody can work on an experimental aircraft. And a condition inspection can be done by the owner who has a repairman with an inspection rating or a maintenance rating. The inspection rating, this is a little bit different for those of you that have A&P certificates. Normally you have an A&P and then you get your inspection authorization, which is a higher type rating. This is different. The repairman with an inspection rating is a a basic level repairman. The repairman with the maintenance rating is a higher level. So those are the two airworthiness certificates that are going to come out. Okay, here we're going to talk just a little bit about the Sport Pilot certificate itself. There's a lot of confusion out there about the Sport Pilot certificate. I have a lot of calls coming to my office every day saying, I have a private pilot certificate and I want to get a Sport Pilot certificate. What you need to understand about this is if you have a private pilot certificate, single engine land, you have basically the Sport Pilot privileges. So you can fly as a Sport Pilot. Just like somebody that has a airline transport pilot rating, if he's out on the weekend, or airline transport pilot certificate, let me rephrase that, and he's out flying on the weekend, just flying in a 172, he might have an airline transport pilot certificate, but he's exercising privileges of a private pilot. So if I have a private pilot certificate and I want to go fly in a sport pilot type aircraft, light sport aircraft, then I'm exercising privileges of the sport pilot. So that's for us that already have certificates. For those people that have never had a certificate and you're going to go and earn a sport pilot certificate or a flight instructor with a sport pilot rating, these certificates are a little bit different. Those of us that have certificates right now, it'll say private pilot, airplane, single engine land. These will have no category and class ratings on them. What you'll see is it'll just say sport pilot. So you'll have a certificate and it'll say sport pilot, and that's all it'll say. Everything's done by privileges with this certificate level. What is a privilege? It's basically a logbook endorsement. So when I finish and I take my check ride and the examiner writes out my temporary certificate, he's going to endorse my logbook, and that's what's going to give me my single engine land or powered parachute or whatever I have. So does that mean I have to carry my logbook on every flight that I go to? You could, but what a lot of the organizations, EAA, AOPA, is already saying they're going to do, and you can make up your own, it's a logbook or a record of the endorsement. So what you could have is a photocopy of the logbook endorsement. You could make up your own little card, have the examiner sign that as the endorsement. You got to have some type of a record that you have got this privilege. So what you'll have to carry is your certificate and that endorsement, however you decide to do that. But like I said, it's done by privileges. They're called privileges and not ratings. There's going to be a brand new form. It's an 8710-11 that you're going to fill out to get this new certificate. It looks a lot like the 8710-1, which is those of us that's gotten certificates already knows what that is, maybe if you remember, but it's a form you filled out. And the reason why we put this up here is because this is a brand new form specifically for Sport Pilot, and there's a few things that are a little bit different on it. One of them is called a proficiency check, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Now, you might say, well, why would anybody want this rule? Why would you want to get a Sport Pilot certificate if I'm out there just flying one of those two-place trainers? The biggest thing about this whole rule and what made everybody so excited about it was you can credit all the experience that you have flying towards higher certificate ratings. So if you are out there flying a powered parachute, weight shift machine, what used to be an ultralight type aircraft, you can come back now, and once you get the certificate and the aircraft's got an airworthiness certificate on it, N number, you can take that and apply it towards private, commercial, and ATP. That was one of the biggest selling points of the whole rule. Okay, this was a big thing here. What about the medical? I'm going to go through real first and say operations requiring either a medical or, and this is the first time, U.S. driver's license, valid U.S. driver's license. This is the first certificate that the FAA has ever put out that required a valid U.S. driver's license or a medical to be able to fly. The people that have to have one or the other, if you're a student pilot seeking sport pilot privileges, you're a pilot, private pilot, recreational pilot, ATP, commercial, whatever, and you're exercising the privileges of a sport pilot. In other words, all I'm out there doing is flying a little light sport type aircraft on a Sunday afternoon. I can use either one, a driver's license or a medical. If I'm a flight instructor acting as PIC for light sport aircraft, so when would that be? if that would probably be if I was training a student pilot. So one of those two, I can use either one, private pilot, or I can use a medical or a valid U.S. driver's license. Okay, a person using a current and valid U.S. driver's license. This is a kind of a catch. A lot of people will say this. You got to comply with the restriction and limitation imposed on the driver's license. So if your driver's license says you have to wear glasses to drive, then you have to wear glasses to fly. That's how that works. You also have to comply with any judicial or administrative order applying to the operation of a motor vehicle. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean, well, the biggest thing it means, if I have DUI or drug possession, conviction, anything like that, and my driver's license gets suspended, then I can't go fly. If my valid U.S. driver's license is suspended for, like I said, medical, or if it's just suspended, then I can't fly on it. Okay? So does that mean I could go over and get a medical? If I can receive a medical, could I go fly? You could if it wasn't drugs or alcohol type conviction. Because when you go over to get the medical, you sign there saying, I don't have any drug or alcohol convictions. But let's say your driver's license gets suspended because I run 3 stoplights and had 2 accidents, and the judge says, man, you can't drive. Well, you can't fly on your or you can't fly on it either because he took your driver's license away. But if you can go get a medical, you can fly on the medical. So that's how it works. The only time you can't use either one is for drugs and alcohol. If you've got a problem there with a conviction or anything like that with drugs and alcohol, then you can't use either one. Okay, a person using a valid driver's license. And I keep using the term valid U.S. driver's license because, like I said, it has to be valid. It has to be current, and it has to be a U.S. driver's license. Okay? You can use your driver's license if you have never been denied your most recent application for a medical certificate, if you've ever applied for a medical certificate. Now, if you've never applied for a medical certificate, this has nothing to do with you. But if you've applied and been denied, you have to somehow get that done, jump through whatever hoops you have to get through one time to get that straightened out. And it's for your most recent medical, even if it was 30 years ago. You got denied. You got to get that worked out. If you've never had your most recent medical certificate suspended or revoked, then you'll have to work that out. Okay? So suspended, revoked, or denied. If any of those 3 things have happened, you have to work that out before you can fly using a driver's license. Now, if you got a special issuance, let's say the FAA come down and they said, we're going to issue a 3rd-class medical, but we're only going to make it good for 3 months. That's a special issuance. That's fine. A special issuance is not a denial. All you have to do is just never go back. Just let it lapse. Okay? So that's the medical and how it works. Now, if your special issuance is withdrawn, in other words, they give it to you and they write you a letter saying give it back, that's a different situation. They've taken it back now. So then you have to work through that. And that's the medical. Now, no matter what, this catches every pilot, whether you're a ATP with a 1st-class medical or a recreational pilot with a 3rd-class medical. 6123 speaks directly to Sport Pilot. 6153 speaks to everybody else. What this says is you cannot fly if you have have a known or have reason to know any medical condition that would make you unable to fly. So how do you pass this little litmus test? What you have to do is be able to stand up in the mirror, look at yourself, say, can I safely fly today? If you can't answer that question, yes, I can safely fly today, then you can't fly. So even though you have a license, a medical, or whatever, if for some reason today you can't safely fly, this FAR 6123 says that you can't fly. And this catches every pilot out there. Okay, we've got through the certificate, got through the airworthiness certificates, the pilot certificate. I'm going to talk a little bit about the knowledge test, and we're getting ready to go into the how do I get the sport pilot certificate. Well, first of all, every transitioning pilot or every brand new sport pilot is going to have to take a knowledge test. Now, for those who have already taken the knowledge test, has a private pilot or recreational pilot certificate, you don't have to take this knowledge test. But for everybody else that's never taken one before, you have to take a minimum of a sport pilot test. It's a 40-question test. That's a generic test that I'm going to show you what's on it here in just a minute. If you wanted to go to sport pilot flight instructor, it's a 70-question test. That test is for each category of a sport pilot or light sport aircraft that there is. And then if you want to decide you want to be an examiner, that's a 50-question test. So these are the 3 tests that are associated with sport pilot. Here's the basic sport pilot test itself. Remember I told you 1 test for all categories of light sport aircraft. There's no performance or systems questions on there, and the reason why we did that was because of the 7 categories, balloon, airship. You can't really get specific about aircraft performance, airplane performance, or gyroplane performance and expect a balloon guy to know what you're talking about. Or I'm not a balloon person, so if we started talking about performance of a balloon and that kind of thing as an airplane person, I really wouldn't know what they were talking about. So what we did is we just came up with a generic test that has, and this is rule-driven right here, of what we have to have, these categories. So we talk a little bit about air traffic control, airport operations, airspace. This is generic to everybody that flies. Like I said, there's 1 test for all categories. Now, does this mean that I'll never be asked any type of systems questions about whatever I'm going to fly? No, because when we go take the practical test, which Marty's going to talk about here in just a minute, what consists of a practical test, part of a practical test is the oral, the questioning, the question and answer part. That's where you're going to get, if you bring in an airplane, and that's what you want to get your certificate in, that's where you'll get your system and performance type questions. They'll be asked of you by the examiner. Now, for the instructor and examiner test, we decided because this is a higher level certificate, we decided to make 1 test for each category. Therefore, we were able to put back in aerodynamics, aircraft performance, aircraft systems, plus all the other categories that was on the other test. Once again, does this mean that's the last time I'll ever see that? I will guarantee you when you go take the practical test, the examiner is going to go over and ask these type questions again. We were just able to, because 1 test for each category, if you go in to take a sport pilot instructor test for airplane, we can now ask those questions on the test, and that's what will be on that 70-question test for the instructor or the 50-question test for the examiner. Okay? Now we're going to talk a little bit about the practical test standards, and I'm going to turn it over to Marty to do that.
Thank you, Larry. The practical test standards in the sport pilots are going to be a little bit different than what you're normally used to seeing at the private pilot, commercial pilot level. One of the challenges we had was we trying to keep the number of books down to a minimum instead of having another 7, 8 books. We wanted to keep it so we're only going to wind up with 3 in the sport pilot. But by doing that, what we had to do was had to take the general information, which is in all the PTSs, and then the pilot categories are up front. Then we have a second introduction and has the sport pilot tasks that are required for the flight instructor, sport pilot in that area. So you'll have the pilot side in the front and the sport pilot flight instructor in the back of the practical test standard itself, and that's the way it'll be organized. Here are the 4 practical test standards. 3 of them are the sport pilot. We have the airplane, gyroplane, and glider in 1 book. We have the airship balloon in another book, and the weight shift parachute in the 3rd book. So we only had to come up with 3 books. So it could condense pretty good. They're not very thick, but they're condensed. Now, in the rulemaking procedures, they allowed to get a private pilot certificate in a weight shift or parachute. So we had to come up with a new practical test standard at that level. So that's new. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Within the practical test standards, there's a lot of guidance in there to the examiner, but it's also the flight instructor and also the applicant. because everybody should know what's in there. Because it's, you know, one thing about what we've done since 1984 is we told you what you're going to be tested on. There's no secrets. You have the answers. You just got to be able to perform. Okay? So that's the way these are written. And so the guidance is in here for not only the examiner, but the flight instructor and the applicant himself. Within the practical test standards, it is rule-driven, just like the aeronautical knowledge side of it. The areas of operations are listed in 61.311 for the sport pilot. And that's all the area operations follow that rule. But under the area operations, we develop tasks that are associated with that area of operation. And within that task, we have elements. The elements have the examiner ask you questions about knowledge, about performance, and they'll have in their conditions and standards. And some of them might even have safety considerations. So when we look at Area Operation 1, which is pre-flight preparation, you can see these are all the tasks associated before you go fly, such as knowing about your qualifications as a pilot, and then the aircraft's qualifications for documentation and maintenance, the obtaining weather information, the National Airspace System, operations of systems, aeromedical factors. These are all listed within that area of operation. As Larry said, we captured principles of flight performance is here, but principles of flight and weight and balance, some of that information is in area operation 2 because that's unique to this PTS. When we look at the task itself, this sample task here is National Airspace System. So the examiner asked the applicant to explain basic VFR weather minimums for the various airspaces that the pilot might be able to fly in, such as B, C, D, E, and G. Now, remember Larry said that all privileges at the sport pilot level are by endorsement from an instructor. So as a sport pilot, you cannot fly in Class D airspace such as Wiley Post unless you have an endorsement in your logbook from that instructor saying you can do that. All right? So it's a little different. Satisfactory performance is obviously you got to perform within the standards. Mastery of the aircraft, never seriously in doubt. That means the examiner doesn't scratch and say, geez, I wonder what that maneuver was I just observed. Okay? So it's never seriously in doubt. You got to be proficient, single pilot competency. Now everybody says, well, what's a crew resource management have to do with weight shift aircraft or parachute? Well, when we're talking about crew resource management, we're not only talking about the pilot, we're talking about the pilot making decisions about maintenance. Does he know enough about this aircraft, or does he need to get assistance from a mechanic to determine if this aircraft's airworthy? Has he checked the weather using flight service or whatever they use for weather determination? Okay? So that's what it's meant there. When we talk about unsatisfactory performance, if the examiner has to grab the controls to protect their body, okay, that would be obviously a good reason not to pass the check ride. Or ineffective visual scanning. This is an emphasis item because in today's environment, there's a lot of aircraft out there, okay, no matter what airport you're at. Consistently exceeding intolerances and failure to take prompt corrective action. Those constitute unsatisfactory performance. Now, how-to. We've got all the way up to the how-to part. If you are a new or unregistered member of EAA, USUA, ASC, you just come off the street September 14, 2004, and you want to become a sport pilot. One of the things you'll have to do is get a student pilot certificate. Now, you're going to be able to do that by filling out that application, the 871011. You go to your friendly sport pilot examiner or designated pilot examiner or the local district office, and they'll issue you a student pilot certificate. You'll need a student pilot certificate in order to solo or solo cross country. Okay? So you'll need to obtain that. You'll need to meet the minimum experiences as described in the rule itself. These are the minimum for the totals, such as 12 hours in the parachute. You have to have 12 hours total, but 10 of that has to be with an instructor, 2 of it has to be soloed, and then it's broken down in the cross-country time preparation for the check ride. Okay? So that's the way that time's broken down. Have to pass a knowledge test, as Larry pointed out, 40-question test, and pass a practical test standard with an FAA-designated pilot examiner. If you are a registered ultralight pilot on or before 1 September, all the organizations up at Oshkosh, at ASC, their national convention. They were all pushing people to join their organizations prior to 1 September, because if you did that, the advantage you have is that once you're ready to take your check ride, you get a certified copy of your flight time from the organization you belong, and you meet the medical requirements and the basic sport pilot requirements. Medical requirements could be what? Have a valid driver's license, okay? You don't have to meet the aeronautical knowledge, proficiency, or experience requirements. What that means is we're going to credit your time with that ultralight or AFI or BFI instructor to take this check ride. We're going to give you that credit. We're going to say you met the requirements, we'll give you that credit. But you're going to have to pass a knowledge test, and you'll have to pass the practical test, okay? So those are the requirements. If you belong to that organization prior to 1 September. If you're a member of that organization after 1 September, then you're starting all over, not all over, but you're starting from new. So now you can get a copy of your flight time from the organization saying you meet the requirements, meet the medical and flight time requirements, but you'll have to get an endorsement from an instructor saying you've met the knowledge and proficiency and experience requirements, and you can credit your ultralight flight time towards the sport pilot rating, okay? Still got to pass the knowledge test and pass the practical test. So the advantages of joining before was the fact that you didn't have to get the instructor endorsement. Now, if you join, you'll have to get an instructor endorsement. Okay, if you already hold a pilot certificate, like Larry did, he holds an ATP, but now he wants to fly a parachute, okay? He's got an advantage over all of us, because all he's got to do now is receive the training in that category that he wants to add. If he wants to add a parachute certificate privileges to his pilot certificate, he's not going to get anything added to his certificate itself. It's going to be in his logbook endorsement. He has to get the required training from an authorized instructor. That means an instructor that has a parachute authorization in his logbook. He has to complete an application. And once he has the application, he finds another parachute instructor to give him a proficiency check. So he never sees an FAA person again. He sees another instructor to issue him the privileges to fly the parachute, okay? So if you already hold a pilot certificate, adding these categories is pretty easy. There's no knowledge test required, no practical test. It's a proficiency check with endorsements. Now, private pilot. Why would you want a private pilot weight shift or parachute? Well, if you want to tow the ultralight type aircraft in one of those weight shift type aircraft, you'd probably want to have that. If you want to fly at night in a weight shift or parachute, you'd have to have a private pilot certificate, because remember, sport pilot cannot fly at night. If you want to fly above 10,000 feet, I don't know why somebody would want to fly that high, but if you did, you'd have to have a private pilot certificate. If you wanted to fly in all the airspaces without worry, because at the private pilot level, you're trained in all the airspaces, unlike at the sport pilot level, it's endorsements, okay? You can do it that way. So, and the other privileges associated with a private pilot. Now, I want to become a sport pilot instructor. If you're new to the program, you have to have a sport pilot certificate or higher. You have to gain the minimum total experience, as you see here. But this is also broken down into the total experience is 100 hours, but it says, when you further look in the rule, it says 50 hours of parachute time. So it's broken down, so you need to break it down. You have to pass the fundamentals of instruction test. You have to pass a flight instructor sport pilot knowledge test and pass a practical test with a sport pilot flight instructor examiner. If you're already an FAA certified instructor, makes it easy here. All you have to do is hold a category class rating in whatever you want to get. So in Larry's case, say he got his endorsement for the parachute. Now he wants to be a parachute flight instructor. He holds the category class. He must comply with the requirements of 415, which tells an instructor all the privileges and limitations that they have at the sport pilot level. He has to have 5 hours of flight time and make and model of light sport aircraft within the same set of aircraft. Now this is new term, set of aircraft. Within the light sport aircraft community, what the ASTM committee is going to do is say, okay, all airplanes that have a tractor-type engine and tail draggers belong to one set of aircraft. All airplanes that have the tail wheel on the wrong end and are pusher airplanes will be a different set of aircraft, okay? The gyroplane community will do that, the parachute community will do that, the weight shift will do that. So that's what they mean by set of aircraft. So what will happen after about January 1st of 2005 is you'll see a list of set of aircraft on our website. So if you want to fly in that set of aircraft, you have to have 5 hours make and model, get an instructor endorsement in that set of aircraft, okay? So that's new to the program, unique to this. If you are a registered ultralight flight instructor, a BFI, UFI, AFI already, on or before September 1st, 2004, you have until January 31st, 2008 to apply for a certificate if you already belong to one of those organizations. You have to hold a support pilot certificate or higher in the appropriate category and class. You provide a certified copy from the organization. You gain that minimum total experience requirements. You pass an FOI, and it says one exception. This exception is if you belong to ASE, EAA, or USUA, and you've already passed an FOI test, and they'll give you a letter saying you've passed this test, then we will recognize that you've demonstrated the knowledge, okay? So you won't have to take it again. Pass the knowledge test for the category class you're seeking. Remember Larry said each category class at the flight instructor level has its own knowledge test. And then pass the practical test with a sport pilot flight instructor examiner. Now, you want to be a sport pilot examiner, all right? First thing you got to do is you got to be 21 years of age. You got to hold at least a sport pilot certificate or higher. You got to have a good record. Now, what's that mean? That means you couldn't have been asked to come to the district office more than 3 times in the last 4 days, okay? So, I mean, that's, but have a good record. I knew you guys would laugh sooner or later. Okay, meet all the eligibility and experience requirements as specified for the designation sought. What's going to happen is there's a brand new form coming out. We hope to have it out after October 1st. On that form will list the requirements of what it takes to be an examiner, sport pilot examiner. Once you meet all those requirements, you fill out that form and you'll send it to Oklahoma City, here, locally, to the Light Sport Standardization Board. This is brand new in the program. What exists today is called the National Examiner Board. The National Examiner Board evaluates all designated pilot examiner applicants. This board, because as I mentioned earlier, is unique is because we appoint the examiners, we do the oversight, we will qualify the individuals. You meet all the requirements, you'll get a nice letter saying go take the knowledge test. Got to take the 50-question knowledge test, you got to get an 80% on it. Once you get that passed, you send the original copy to us, and then as the need fits, we'll invite you to the examiner standardization course. Now this course, unlike the DPE course where the district office is responsible for training the designated pilot examiners within their district. So when you come out here to Oklahoma to go to the pilot examiner course like the one that's going on this week, you only get academic training. You get all your flight training at the district office. In our case, this course will have an academic portion and a flight portion. Part of the flight portion is either to issue an initial CFI certificate in that category if you don't hold it, give you additional privileges if you don't hold it, or validate the flight instructor certificate you have. Once we get to that, then we'll continue with the training and we'll train you as a sport pilot examiner. So that's the way that program will work. A little different way of doing business. And that's what it means. It says pass the practical test. That's the last thing you got to do.
Hi, I'm John Riffey. I'm a flight instructor with the Light Sport Aviation branch in Oklahoma City.
And my name is Larry Clymer. I'm an aviation safety inspector with the Light Sport Aviation branch here in Oklahoma City. What we're going to do here today is do a question and answer session with John asking me some of the questions that we've been hearing out in the field for the last 6 months at some of the fly-ins that we've been attending.
Larry, my first question is, what does an existing private pilot need to do to fly as a sport pilot?
Well, John, what you need to think about there is as a private pilot, you are able to exercise privileges of a sport pilot. So if you're flying a fixed wing type aircraft, if you have private pilot single engine land on your certificate and you want to fly a light sport aircraft that's a fixed wing airplane, then all you really have to do is be current with a flight review and go out and fly. And in addition to having the flight review, John, what you're going to have is also your 3 takeoff and landings within 90 days. And the medical is two parts. If you're going to exercise privileges as a sport pilot, you can do that on a valid U.S. driver's license. You'll be limited to light sport type aircraft. If you do have your medical, a third-class airman medical, then you'll be able to also exercise privileges of the private pilot. In other words, you can fly at night, you can fly into above 10,000 feet. If you do not have the medical, though, you'll be limited to daylight flying only, VFR flying, which is at least 3 miles visibility, and you will not be able to fly at night. Okay, John, what's the next question?
What is meant by make and model within a set of aircraft?
That's a good question, John. The make and model within a set of aircraft is a new term that the FAA is using, and what we're going to do is the FAA, in conjunction with industry, is going to work together and come up with a set of aircraft that have various different make and models in it. What you'll see is we're going to have on the AFS 610 website a area that you can go to that if you are signed off in one particular aircraft, the rest of the aircraft that are in that set of aircraft, if you're signed off in one, you'll be signed off in all of them. So you won't have to have an endorsement for each make and model. If you have an endorsement for one make and model, you're signed off in that set of aircraft and you can fly any aircraft in that set.
What does an existing CFI need to do to instruct sport pilot students?
Simply stated, a CFI may instruct sport pilot students within the category listed in the CFI certificate. CFIs instructing at the sport pilot level are subject to the limitations of 61.415. One of the unique limitations of 61.415 is that a CFI must have 5 hours of pilot and command time in the make and model within a set of aircraft.
Larry, I've been getting a lot of questions about flying experimental aircraft, and I understand that the rules have changed for carrying passengers.
That's correct, John. The new rule changes 6131K, which now requires a pilot hold a category class rating for an experimental aircraft for which they wish to carry passengers. 6163 and 61165 have been modified to establish these requirements to allow pilots that have experience in experimental aircraft without the appropriate rating to obtain these privileges. The requirements are from 1 September 2004 to 31 August 2005, the pilot obtained 5 hours of pilot and command time in category and class, then receive an endorsement from an instructor stating that the pilot is proficient, then complete an 8710-1 airman application. Once that's completed, the pilot go to a designated pilot examiner or the local flight standards district office where they will be issued a temporary certificate with a category class rating.
This concludes Section 1. I hope that our questions and answers here will help those of you in the field with your questions. Thank you.
This second part of this is talking about registration, certification, marking of light sport aircraft, and also the maintenance requirements. Okay. Remember I told you there were 3 possibilities of the new airworthiness certificate. The special light sport aircraft that the FAA is commonly terming right now SLSA. Now the airworthiness inspectors, they don't like this term because it's not really what it is, but that's what we're calling it because pilots can understand that. So that's how we got to this. But a special light sport aircraft, or SLSA, is a factory built to a consensus standard, tested, ready to fly walk up, turn the key, and fly away type aircraft, just like the Cessnas and the Pipers and every other airplane out there. The only difference is those are built to a type certificate. These are built to a consensus standard, and I'll talk about a consensus standard here in just a minute. Now, the experimental light sport aircraft, brand new airworthiness certificate. Actually, it's a brand new certificate that's experimental, but most people that are used to experimental type aircraft are used to the experimental operating amateur build type certificates. This one is not like that. This one is experimental light sport, ELSA is what we're going to call it. And there's multiple different ways you can actually get this. Existing so-called fat or heavy ultralights, the one that don't meet the 103 rule, aircraft not meeting 103, like I said, you have a 36-month window to transition those aircraft in. So somebody that has a trike, a powered parachute, ultralight type aircraft that doesn't meet 103, you got 36 months to transition that aircraft over to this new experimental light sports airworthiness certificate. If you don't do that, let's say you have a trike out here, you've been flying, some gentleman walked up and said, hey, a friend of mine has 100 hours in a trike, he was wanting to know about pilot certification. Well, let's say that guy decides, I don't want to do that. 36 months, after that 36-month window closes, you can never fly that aircraft again. It's a lawn ornament. So you have 36 months to transition over for those type of aircraft. Brand new aircraft built from a kit meeting that consensus standard. In other words, a company comes out with a special light sport aircraft, built it one time, they prove they could build it, now they can take the wheels off of it, call it a kit, sell it to you. As a kit, you can put the wheels back on it, and it's now a experimental light sport aircraft. Okay? If you buy a special light sport aircraft from a company that was renting it and doing flight instruction, it's a special light sport aircraft. It has higher maintenance standards. And you decide, I'm not really going to do it for rental. I just want to maintain it myself. You can take that one and downgrade that special to an experimental, and now you can maintain it yourself. That would be a reason why you'd want to do that. So there's 3 ways that you can get into an experimental light sport airworthiness certificate. Okay? Now, other aircraft that meet the definition of LSA, the standard, primary, and experimental amateur built, those aircraft that have those airworthiness certificates on them meet the definition of light sport aircraft, but once you certify an aircraft with a standard, like if you have a J3 Cub with a standard airworthiness certificate on it, you can't transfer that over to experimental light sport or special light sport. If it already has an airworthiness certificate on it, it stays with that airworthiness certificate, okay? And it's also maintained under the provisions of that airworthiness certificate. So a J3 Cub is an airplane that a sport pilot can fly, but it still takes that AMP to maintain that. Okay? Same thing with experimental amateur build. There's only one repairman certificate with an experimental amateur build, and that's the guy that built 51% of it. He's the one that gets it. If he sells it, he's the only one that still gets that repairman certificate with it. That repairman certificate doesn't transfer. So if he sells it to somebody else, it has to be an AMP that maintains it, or you have to take it back to that one person. Okay, now we have a note here that they wanted me to put in, which I just already talked about. It says, once an aircraft has been certified in standard, primary, or experimental amateur build, they remain under that certificate. You can't change it, okay? Okay, the consensus standard. Remember I talked about the consensus standard. We talked about it in the other presentation. It's an industry-developed consensus standard that applies to aircraft design, production, and airworthiness. FAASTeam got together, or actually the industry went to FAASTeam. They developed this F-37 committee, and they come out with all these standards, which includes, but are not limited to, design and performance, equipment, continued airworthiness, identification and recording of major repairs, alterations, operating instructions, the industry got together and said, we're going to build an aircraft that has all this in it. And when you buy this aircraft, it'll be conformed to this standard. So you don't have companies out there building to whatever standard they want to. They have to build it to this FAASTeam standard. Okay. When you buy a special light sport aircraft, remember this is one that can be used for rental, for instruction, and for towing. The FAA is going to issue a special airworthiness certificate, and it's going to have light sport category on it for these factory-built, ready-to-fly aircraft, everything except for the gyroplane. The gyroplane is still going to be experimental amateur built. But for everything else, they'll issue this certificate, and this may be used for sport and recreation, flight training, for hire, and for towing or rental. Okay, and when you buy this special this SLSA, Special Light Sport Aircraft, you'll get a statement of compliance. Every aircraft that rolls down this assembly line will get a statement of compliance that has this information on it. It'll identify what type of aircraft it is, the manufacturing, the serial number, the consensus standard that was used to build this under. It'll state that it meets this consensus standard, and it conforms to the manufacturer's design data and meets all the quality assurance systems and everything like that. And you'll get a piece of paper, actually several pieces of paper, that has this statement of compliance with it. Okay, it goes on to say that it'll identifies all the applicable operating instructions, maintenance and inspection procedures, everything you need to do to maintain this aircraft, and any flight training supplements that are needed. This is a big one right here. Identifies the system used to monitor and correct safety of flight issues through issuance of safety directives and or continuous airworthiness systems. So these aircraft are going to be subject to safety directives, or if it's got a certified engine on it, airworthiness directives. And it tells you how you're going to get this information. And it also states that the manufacturer is going to give the FAA unlimited access to their facilities so we can make sure and monitor that they're doing this. The biggest thing that you're going to get is the last one. It's been ground and flight tested. A lot of these machines that are out there now, they roll off the assembly line, they pack them all up, they send them to somebody, the person puts them together, and they're the first person that's ever flown it. Could be. They could be the test pilot. In this particular case, this aircraft has been flight tested. When it rolls off the assembly line, there's somebody there that puts their airworthiness certificate on it, the DAR, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and then somebody's flight tested it. So when you get it, you've already known it's been flight tested. And the biggest thing, it's in a condition for safe operation. So that's what's going to come out with every special light sport aircraft. Okay, now the experimental light sport aircraft, ELSA as we call them. I've already said that owners of existing ultralight-like aircraft, the two-place trainers that are out there right now that don't meet Part 103, and like Marty said before, if your aircraft is a true 103 machine, in other words, it weighs less than 254, it's only got 5 gallons of gas on it, it's got one seat. If that's your aircraft, this rule doesn't have anything to do with you. You can continue to fly and have all kinds of fun. However, if your aircraft don't meet that rule, then you're going to fall into the light sport type aircraft and go all the way up to 1320. If you don't meet that one, then you go up from there. But now, like I said, this is very important. Must have their aircraft registered and an experimental certificate issued by January 31st, 2008. This is a very important date. And the big term here is issued. That doesn't mean that on January 15th I can apply for registration, because you're probably not going to make the January 31st date. If you don't make the January 31st date, like I said before, your aircraft now becomes a lawn ornament. You can never, ever fly it again. Okay? So, experimental light sport. I talked a little bit about experimental amateur build, the 51% rule, all that kind of good stuff. This experimental light sport aircraft airworthiness certificate does not have to meet the 51% rule. Like I said, the manufacturer, once he's built a special light sport, and he only has to build one, if he's done that, he can take and say, I'm going to build kit aircraft from here on out. And it's up to the manufacturer to decide what the kit is. It could be, place this placard on here, and that's the kit. It could be, like the Quicksilvers, I know they come in, all torn apart with the rails and everything and the tubes all in different pieces of paneling and everything like that. It could be broken down that far. It's whatever the manufacturer wants it to be, okay? So there's no 51% rule on this experimental light sport aircraft. Now the big thing, experimental light sport aircraft are not eligible to be operated for hire, flight training, or towing, okay? Now there is an exception to this rule, which we'll talk about, but that exception talks about the transitioning aircraft, and for a period of 5 years, the transitioning aircraft coming over, the two-place trainers out there, can continue to be used for flight training. Okay, experimental kit versions of this aircraft, like I said before, are kit versions of special light sport aircraft that have been manufactured under 21-191. What is that? It has to be evidence that a manufacturer has at least produced one special light sport. If he's done that, they have to have aircraft operating instructions, which they should have because it's the exact same as a special light sport, except the manufacturer said it's going to be a kit. So you should get operating instructions. Maintenance and inspection procedures, you should get that with your aircraft. A manufacturer statement of compliance, okay? That same statement of compliance that was with the specials, you'll get with the experimental because it's basically the same airplane except the manufacturer just didn't finish putting it together. You're going to do that. These aircraft are not, like I said, not eligible for hire, training, or rental. And if it's a foreign manufactured aircraft, and there's a lot of, me and Marty both have been to a lot of air shows, and there's a lot of foreign manufacturers out there just waiting to flood the market with foreign aircraft. And there's a lot of nice looking models out there that I've looked at. So what has to happen here is the foreign manufactured kits have to show evidence of a bilateral airworthiness agreement. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an airworthiness agreement or a bilateral agreement for light sport aircraft, just that our country and their country have got together and we have a bilateral agreement with that country. If that exists, we have that bilateral airworthiness agreement or equivalent exists for airplanes, which is what this little thing here is showing. Bilateral agreement shows a working relationship between countries. If we have that, then you're going to see a lot of kits come in from these other countries. And there's a lot of people waiting right here to receive them and start selling them. Okay, who may issue airworthiness certificates for these light sport aircraft? Two groups of people, DARs, which are designated airworthiness representatives. Those are guys that are not employed by the FAA, but work on behalf of the FAA. So when they're out there, they're wearing the FAA cap and they're working on behalf of the administrator. Those are probably what we see as, just like in experimental amateur build, mostly DARs do that. We see that as being the primary function, and these people will probably issue most of the airworthiness certificates. However, an FAA safety inspector, an ASI, either it works for the FSDO or the MIDO, can go out and do this. And we expect some of this to happen right at first, but mainly it's going to be for training and currency for those guys and when they go out to monitor the DARs out there. So you probably won't see a lot of FAA guys doing this. Okay, DARs are private people. They set their own, it's market driven. The FAA doesn't get involved on how much they charge to do this or perform this function, but they do work on behalf of the FAA. And like I say, may charge a fee for this service. This is a little bit more technical. For the DARs, they work by function codes, and there's going to be 2 more function codes added to the DAR that will allow them to do the light sport type aircraft airworthiness certificates, either for experimental or special light sport. That's just how they can do their job. Okay, where do I find one of these DARs? You bought an experimental amateur build, or not an experimental amateur build, you bought a experimental light sport aircraft from, let's say, Infinity Power Parachutes. He shipped it down here to you. You bought the kit built version. He shipped it down here to you, and that manufacturer might have said, if you put this sticker on here, you've got it. All you have to do now is get you a DAR to come out and do the certification for you. So how do you find one of these guys? Well, you can go to this big, long FAA website, or you can call the friendly neighborhood FSDO office, and they'll tell you where these DARs are at. But this is the FAA website that you can go to and find a DAR for your area, or you can call the FSDO or MIDO and say, hey, where's a DAR that can do this for me? Okay, how do I get an airworthiness certificate? Well, you can't mail in and get it, and the DAR can't just mail it to you. The DAR or the ASI must come out and physically inspect the aircraft to determine if it's eligible for certification, and the big word here is in a condition for safe operation. So a couple of things can happen. After the inspection, if the ASI or DR makes the determination that the aircraft meets all the requirements and you put it together correctly, he'll provide you with a 8130-7 Special Airworthiness Certificate, which I'm going to show you a picture of that here in a minute. He'll provide you with operating limitations for this aircraft that have to be attached to that airworthiness certificate and have to be in the aircraft to be able to fly it. Okay? If for some reason he comes out and the application is denied, like he's looking at it and he went over and shook it and the wheel fell off, he's probably not going to issue you an airworthiness certificate at that point, and he should give you a letter saying, do something about the wheel falling off, and then I'll come back and we'll look at it again. But the key word here is he's got to come out and inspect your aircraft, and he's got to find it in a condition for safe operation before he's going to issue your airworthiness certificate. And Marty's going to talk about this here in a minute, and you got to be it's got to be registered before he can even come out. Okay, and you got to have your registration certificate. Okay, here's a special airworthiness certificate, and believe it or not, they're really, I want to call them pink. This is what they look like. This one here is Special Airworthiness Certificate for Light Sport category. So this is for the Special LSA, what we're calling Special LSA. This is what the certificate will look like. Attached to this pink certificate will be your operating limitations, which tells you everything that we've already talked about, how to operate it, how to maintain it. That might be several pages long. This certificate with your operating limitations have to be in the aircraft before you can fly it. This next one is the exact same Special Airworthiness Certificate, but notice this one says Experimental Operating Light Sport Aircraft. The people that have built the 51% kits, they get this exact same airworthiness certificate, says Special Airworthiness. Theirs says Experimental, but theirs says Operating Amateur Built. This one is the two-place trainers that the kit built that I talked about, the transitioning aircraft coming over. This is what they'll get, Experimental Operating Light Sport Aircraft, and this is what it'll look like. Okay? Now Marty's going to go ahead and talk about aircraft registration at this point.
Okay, it points out that the experimental certificate for operating light sport will not be issued, as Larry has emphasized, after January 31st, 2008. And the owner must first register the aircraft. So we'll look at that process here. Once you decide you got this aircraft, if you bought it in a kit or transitioning over, you're going to do a letter requesting registration for first-time registration, because most of these aircraft do not have N numbers on them. So it's a first time, so you have to request an N number. Now, if you like those vanity numbers, like I want to put my wife's birthday, 1903, and then VW, if I want to put that on there, then I can do a vanity deal, but it costs me $15. But if I'll take the next number in line, it only costs $5. So it depends on how long you want to stay married, what you want to put on there. The other thing you can do is you fill out an aircraft registration application. And you'll either fill out a bill of sale, or most likely, if it's a transition type aircraft, a brand new form that's not available yet. It is the 88A Affidavit of Ownership. You have to get this first. These three will go in first before you can do anything else. Once the aircraft is registered, 203 says that you can't operate that aircraft anymore until you get an airworthiness certificate attached to that airframe. Now, if you send a registration form in today, it's going to take 30 to 45 days to get that registration certificate back. That's the kind of lead time you need to allow yourself. So you know in 30 to 45 days, I need to be ready for a DAR if you want to fly that aircraft when you get the registration certificate back. Otherwise, if you wait till after you get the registration, then you can't operate that aircraft because first, you got to have appropriate and current airworthiness certificate. And the big thing right now is you got to have a pilot certificate, sport pilot or higher, to fly that unnumbered aircraft. So it's kind of a catch-22 here, okay? The chicken or the egg, what comes first, the pilot or the aircraft, all right? So we're going to go through that time frame for a little while until we get everything connected here. But remember, once it's an unnumbered, you got to have a current and appropriate airworthiness certificate and a certificate pilot once you put that N number on there. Now, what are the requirements for marking and registration numbers? There's no difference than what we have today. The only difference is this one here. If you have an experimental aircraft today, if it's an amateur built, then you're going to put experimental on it. If you're taking a transition aircraft or a kit version, you're going to put experimental on there someplace where everybody in the world knows it's an experimental aircraft, okay? Up there where it says at the entrance. If it's a special light sport aircraft, then you're going to put the words light sport on it. Now, most likely what's going to happen, if you buy this aircraft from a manufacturer, guess who's going to have it on there already? It's probably going to say light sport already, okay? The minimum height is not less than 2 inches. I want to make sure everybody knows, okay? Not more than 6, we don't want to broadcast, but we want to make sure you're aware of it. Okay, the required markings for the registration numbers. Remember, it says the registration should be 12 inches high and placed on the vertical tail surfaces or the side of the fuselage. If those surfaces are too small, then the rule allows that you can go smaller but not less than 3 inches. Okay? Now, some of you probably seen these weight shift and parachute aircraft, and you say, where in the devil am I going to hang that? You know, because they got tubes, and they go every which way but loose. Okay? Well, what it says here is it has to be displaced horizontally in 2 diametrically opposed positions on any fuselage structure member. So when we were up at Michigan last weekend, what the manufacturers were talking about there is making a placard type deal to put on the side of the airframe to put these numbers on. That's what they're going to do. So, okay, inspection and maintenance of the light sport aircraft. Inspection and maintenance is determined by the airworthiness certificate and the operating limitations issued for the aircraft itself. So if you look at light sport aircraft and SLSA, it has to have a condition inspection and it must be maintained in accordance with Part 43. It's held at a higher standard, okay? Where if I have an experimental light sport aircraft, I only need a condition inspection. Anybody can do the maintenance. You know, your 3-year-old son or daughter could do the maintenance. Doesn't matter. The only thing that matters in an experimental aircraft is the condition inspection, okay? So other previous aircraft that meet the definition of light sport aircraft, such as a J3 Cub or a Luscombe or a Burp Coupe, Air Coupe, they have to meet in accordance with Part 43, right? And they're standard airworthiness aircraft. Conditions required, inspections required, a repairman with an inspection rating, but only on ELSA aircraft. This repairman with inspection rating, and we'll see here in a minute what the time requirements are, you will get a certificate that says repairman inspection, and it'll have an N number on it, and that's the only aircraft that you can do an inspection on, okay? So it's very limited. The inspection rating is very limited. Where if you hold an FAA repairman certificate, it's by category of aircraft, okay? So if you go, and we'll talk about the training here in a minute, if you get a repairman weight shift, you can work on any weight shift aircraft because you've gone through the minimum training required. It's a little different. Or any FAA certified mechanic with airframe and power plant ratings or a repair station can work on those aircraft and sign off the condition inspection. So an inspection rating requires you to attend a 16-hour FAA accepted course. Now most of the organizations we've talked to ASC, USUA, EAA have all said they're going to step up to the plate and start doing these courses right here, these 16-hour courses, so that when you have your transition aircraft, you'll be able to go through that 16-hour course, you'll get a graduation certificate, you go down to the district office, they'll issue you a repairman certificate with an inspection rating, the N number. The training required for a maintenance repairman certificate will consist from 80 to 120 hours. The basic course will be 3 core modules, and then you can add one of the 5 elective modules to receive the repairman certificate for a specific category. The example would be, I want a gyroplane repairman certificate. I have to take the 3 core modules plus the gyroplane module. Once I've completed this course, I take my graduation certificate down to the local flight standards district office, make application, they'll issue me a temporary repairman certificate, maintenance rating, gyroplane. If I want to add any additional ratings to my certificate, all I have to do is complete one of the other elective modules. The annual conditions inspection maintenance rating will allow you to do a annual condition inspections in both ELSA and LSA class rated. That's what the maintenance rating allows. It'll allow you to do a conditions inspection and a 100-hour inspection that's required for any aircraft, SLSA or ELSA, experimental light support aircraft, that is used for compensation or hire, flight training or towing. Because those aircraft, if they're going to continue to operate under the exemption for compensation or hire or training, they'll require a 100-hour inspection. They're going to be held to a higher standard. Okay? So that's the purpose of that. Okay, earlier in the program I mentioned that we were going to turn on the master switch. Well, we turned on the master switch on 1 September. Now, as you can see from the slide here, we have a lot more switches to turn on. One of those switches we need to turn on is the designated airworthiness representative training. This will start in October. The plan is to have applications available to the public so that those individuals interested in becoming a designated airworthiness representative will submit the applications to the National Examiner Board. Once these applications are received, the individuals will be invited to the first course. The first course will be held in November here in Oklahoma City. There will be about 5 individuals invited to that course. There will be about 15 aviation safety inspectors that will participate in that course. That'll be the prototype course. In December, we plan on having 2 additional courses of 20 designated airworthiness representatives at that time. The goal is by January, we will have 45 designated airworthiness representatives out there for the public to use. On the pilot side of it, the Sport Pilot Examiner Program will have applications available about mid-October for the public to fill out, send forward to the Light Sport Standardization Board. Now, this program is going to be different than the current Designated Pilot Examiner Program because the current examiners send their applications, examiner applicants send their applications to the National Examiner Board. Under the Sport Pilot Examiner Program, that's going to be run through our office. And since it's going to be a national program, that the Light Sport Standardization Board will be a different board to evaluate these applications. Once we receive enough applications, we'll have a Light Sport Standardization Board meeting, which should be around the first part of November. We'll evaluate the applicants. We'll get the best qualified. We'll send them letters. They'll be invited to take the knowledge test. Once they've taken the knowledge test, they send us the original back. Once we get the original, we'll send them a letter inviting them to the first courses. The first course for the Sport Pilot Examiner Program will be held in January of '05. Now, the 2 long poles in the tent that we talk about is the aircraft registry and the airman records. The aircraft registry will be able to start accepting applications for registering of existing light sport aircraft by October 15th of this year, okay? The airman applications will not be able to accept them until January 15th of 2005. Now, the only caveat we have in there is that they will accept student pilot applications by the 15th of November of this year. The student pilot application is not really a certificate where they have to issue from Airman Records. They only receive the application itself. Now, the other two parts of the pilot side are the practical test standards and the airman knowledge tests. Both of these items will be available to the public by November of this year. So in order to keep up with what's going on in the program, where we're at with applications, where we're at with guidance, where we're at with advisory circulars, the best way to do that is to look down there on the right to our website, afs600.faa.gov. As soon as the applications, the orders, the guidance, and the advisory circulars become available, they will be available on that website.
What are the maintenance requirements for my experimental light sport aircraft to be used as a trainer?
To be used as a trainer, an experimental light sport aircraft must have an annual condition inspection. Additionally, it must have a 100-hour condition inspection performed. These inspections must be performed by a repairman with a maintenance rating, an appropriately rated A&P mechanic, or appropriately rated repair station.
Larry, my next question is, what are the requirements for a repairman certificate with a maintenance rating?
To become a repairman with a maintenance rating, you're required to take between 80 to 120-hour maintenance course. You'll then take the certificate to the local Flight Standards District Office, where they will issue a temporary certificate with that rating.
What are the inspection requirements for an experimental light sport aircraft not being used for training?
For an experimental light sport aircraft not being used for training, the only inspection required is an annual condition inspection. This inspection can be performed by the owner of the aircraft, providing he holds a repairman certificate with an inspection rating. The inspection can also be performed by a repairman with a maintenance rating, an appropriately rated A&P mechanic, or an appropriately rated repair station.
We hope you enjoyed the two sessions on the sport pilot and light sport aircraft programs. If you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at the phone number or email address listed on the screen. Thank you very much.